So what I want to do today is talk about the legacy of the Roosevelts. I want to answer a few questions that some people have had. I want to show some memorabilia we have and talk a little bit about the kids that they've been asked about a number of times. Who are the kids? What happened to the kids? they're interesting. So to say the least. Anyone have any questions before we get going? Everybody's good. Everybody's awake. Everybody's got their coffee, right, Ann? Nudge, nudge, wink, wink. Yeah. I just want to show you a couple of things before we get. I want to talk a bit more about the legacy. I want to show you some of the memorabilia I've collected just for this class. Some buttons I've had, and these buttons are all originals. It's hard to find original buttons. You can tell they're a little worn out. And an original button will have on the side a Union print shop maker on there. I like this one. This is kind of fun. No third term. And this is more of a pin, like a lapel pin. I can't remember how to. It says FDR, and it's just a backing pin. Just kind of put that on your lapel. Now, these buttons are facsimiles. They say that, repro for the FDR library, but they're kind of fun to have. Reproductions of actual buttons from back in the day. But these don't have a Union print shop bug on them, so that's how you know. So if you are into collecting that kind of stuff, or anybody you know in your family is into collecting that stuff, don't get hoodwinked by buying stuff that's reproduction. Often it'll say that, but if you look on there, look for the Union bug, that's how you know it's a real button and not a facsimile. One of the things I want to share with you, a couple years ago, we were down in Camden, and there used to be a wonderful store of books and antiques and posters and all sorts of stuff called the, I think it was Goose Creek. It was a great, right down off the main street in Camden. They went out of business, but we were in there one day, and Jonathan is my son's a big FDR fan. I think I mentioned before that we went to Hyde Park about 6 years ago for the first time, and he was amazed that this man who suffered so much was smiling all the time. And how do you do that, was his question. So he thought FDR was pretty awesome his entire life. So we were in this store, and there were these, I was going through some photographs, and there were these little photographs of FDR. And these are them. Now, these are not, standard photographs from today. These are unique back in the 30s, kind of black and white, very small photographs. And the top photograph is a shot of FDR in a limousine. He's waving his hat. You can see that or not. The second photograph is a close-up. You can see him right there. And the third photograph is kind of as the car goes by. So these aren't slides or these are actual photographs that someone took of FDR, and John thought that was pretty cool. Someone actually took these, and they ended up in this used bookstore. And we put a Youth for Roosevelt button on the bottom. We took it down to Casco Bay Framing down in Portland. Had that frame. It sits outside Jonathan's bedroom, actually. So I didn't know what those pictures were, and I wrote to the Roosevelt Library and sent photocopies of those pictures, and they sent a bunch of other pictures back. Those are from a trip that FDR made in 1936. He had gone to a conference in South America and stopped in Trinidad and Tobago on his way there and on his way back. On his way back, he actually went on land, and there was a big parade and a motorcade, and people cheered, by the thousands. So the Marine in the pictures is John Roosevelt, the president's son, and the man in a plumed hat is the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, Sir Murchison Fletcher. Now that's a name you don't hear, Murchison. But that's what those guys are. And I thought it was kind of cool to have this memento of that trip. Gets even better because that trip occasioned one of the only two presidents to ever go to Trinidad and Tobago. And a song about the event. So there's actually a folk song on the islands about Roosevelt's going to Trinidad and Tobago. And I'm going to play for you a version of that song sung by a local Trinidadian named Attila the Hun. was his stage name. So listen to the wonderful song. It's in, kind of has that calypso beat. Might be hard to understand over the phone, but listen to this and see what you think.
Roosevelt came to the land of the hummingbird, shouts of welcome were heard. When Roosevelt came to the land of the hummingbird, shouts of welcome were heard. His visit to the island is bound to be an epoch in local history, definitely marking a new era between Trinidad and America. Enthusiasm and jubilation was evinced by the entire population. Friendship for the USA was shown, and from the host of the stars and stripes were flown. For the Spain to open
So that's it's hard to hear that, understand that version, because it's in a very heavily accented. Let me play you a more modern version of the song that has lyrics you can actually understand. But I don't think there's been any other president in the history of the country who's had a folk song written about them. I'm sure there's been some ditties that have been done that aren't very nice, but a gentleman by the of Ry Cooter did a version of that in the 70s, and it's easier to understand.
When Roosevelt came to the land of the hummingbird, shouts of welcome were heard. When Roosevelt came to the land of the hummingbird, shouts of welcome were heard. His visit to their island is bound to be an epoch in local history, definitely marking a new era, keeping Trinidad in America. For this great man's jubilation was evinced by the entire population. Friendship for the USA was shown, from his house to stars and the stripes were flown. For the state threw open the gate to the President of these United States. In fact, everybody was glad to welcome Roosevelt to Trinidad.
Let no one say this class is not well-rounded. You now have heard a 1930s calypso song, then translate. I think you can understand the Ry Cooter version much better than the original version, but I think it's a folk thing that people. This is such a big deal that he stopped by their island and stopped in the town of Port of Spain that they made a song about it. And I'm sure if you went down there and asked someone to sing it somewhere, they could probably pick it up and dust it off and do it again. Because presidents don't stop by that much. Nowadays, when they stop by, it's more of a pain in the butt because they got to shut traffic down, all the stuff they have to do. You wouldn't want to sing a song. If it was a song, it wouldn't be very positive. But I think it's kind of a neat thing, and to have found those pictures and have those for posterity, I think it's kind of cool. And to find this song, I think is really neat. You're not going to get that anywhere else, but right here in this class. So yeah, that was 1936. That he was in Trinidad and Tobago got its independence from the UK in 1962 as part of that big post-World War II throwing off the shackles of colonialism that Roosevelt struggled so mightily to make sure it happened. I think it's kind of a fun little story. Now, I think Peter asked last week about the UN and the connections between Mrs. Roosevelt and the UN and civil rights. People asked about... So here's a picture of this guy walking in the Selma March. There's a UN flag behind him. If you look at Dr. King here, there's a UN flag right behind him. Now, there was some consternation with folks that why would they be flying the UN flag in Alabama as part of a civil rights demonstration? That just showed some people this is part of the one world conspiracy that the UN's trying to take over the world, which I always find interesting since the UN really doesn't have much in the way of teeth as far as enforcing policies, that they would somehow be able to successfully take over the country. I've never quite understood how that works. But Mrs. Roosevelt clearly was involved in civil rights. She was on the NAACP National Board. And I think that flag, and someone actually said, it's a natural offshoot of UN, of the World Human Rights Declaration that we talked about last week, that would weave its way into the civil rights movement. Human rights isn't just for human rights over there, it's also about human rights over here. And so rather than showing an attempt by the UN to take over our civil rights movement, I think it's more an integration of those ideals and philosophies that she had, that she promulgated for so long. They would naturally find an expression in the US civil rights movement. And I think that's what that is. But again, the UN is kind of a boondoggle for some folks, and they don't really get a big kick out of it, and they think it's a threat to security. But those folks that were asked about it said that's why they flew that UN flag. It was a symbol of everyone trying to get their human rights. And it wasn't just here, it was other places. It wasn't just other places, it was here too. And that makes a lot of sense. But she was very much involved, as we said, with the movement. I think it's absolutely quite wonderful that her expression, as evidenced in the UN Declaration, would find fruit within the civil rights movement as it continued on. And it still does today. So does that answer your question, Peter? Yep. Okay, good. So let's talk a little bit.
Yes, it does.
Thank you. Another question people had was about Francis Perkins and Eleanor, and they stayed friends until Eleanor died. They were of like-mindedness. Both, I think, again, after Franklin was gone, trying to find where they fit in this whole scheme of things, and I think they both did very well. Frances was later involved in education after her experience in the White House, as was Eleanor in different ways. So they stayed friends until ER's death, which I'm not surprised to hear about. And someone else also asked about presidential records and how are they kept and who gets those things. I looked that up and went to the National Archives and Records Administration website, and there was the 1986 Act we talked about that further defined things, but initially in 1978, the Presidential Records Act determined that anything that was deemed constitutional, statutory, or ceremonial, and fell under the president's job description there, those items belong to the National Archives. So that would be why this discussion was had, I think, about Missy's papers, because they were some of them, and they were correspondence. So trying to find, the line was a little bit blurred, I think, as to who had ownership of those things. And then Congress had to step in again and say, well, they further defined it, so those things fit under the rubric. So you can go to the FDR Library website and you can search Missy LeHan's papers and read them. And as I said, I love the fact that they've done that. My friend Jim, who some of you met down at the library or know about the library in Boston, actually was in charge of doing most of those archivization and changing the stuff from paper to audiovisual, and so you could read it, digitizing them. So you can sit at home and research all you want on the Kennedys, the Roosevelts, or anybody else. But I like to see it and touch it and feel it and smell it. That's what I like to do with history. But for those folks who can't get around, you can go down, you can read what Missy LeHan wrote to FDR. But just go down the FDR Library website and follow the prompts, and stuff's right there. You can take a look at it. History's not that far away anymore, which I think is awesome. So that answers that question. So let me do one other thing about just housekeeping about tying some things up. I looked over the last week, some of the places that are still around today that have a direct impact with the Roosevelt legacy are obviously the FDR Library. And my understanding is, as part of the National Park Service, as they slowly start opening things up, the grounds, I think the house is closed for a while because they're doing some renovation. That was before all this stuff happened. But I'm guessing from the language they used, if you're planning a little trip to get out of here, the grounds are getting opened up a little bit more and you can get out and see things. I don't know about the library itself. You would call about that. The National Park Service, which runs the Hyde Park House, The Warm Springs House is part of a joint effort between the National Park Service and Georgia State Parks. And then the memorial in D.C. Has anyone been to the Roosevelt Memorial in D.C.? I have not yet. I want to do that. You know, there's two of them in D.C. Do you know where the first one is? Anybody? Unmute yourself if you have an answer. This is like Alex Trebek's daydream right here. Everyone, he controls what people say. Right outside the National Archives is a small, I don't know how big it is, 4 foot by 3 foot kind of granite block that just says Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And for a long time, that's all he wanted to have. That's why his grave is so simple. It's pretty much a mirror image of that. But people decided he needed more. There was a big controversy about it. Remember what the controversy was when they built this place? Is anyone? I feel like Ferris Bueller's
showing him and
yes,
sitting down and not to show his wheelchair.
Right.
How they were going to do that, yeah.
So here's an example. That was the big controversy. That's the statue that they built. If you notice, it's one of those wheelchairs that he had built out of a kitchen chair. But the controversy was they wanted to show Roosevelt's handicap, as we called it back then. A lot of folks said you don't need to do that because he hit it. So you're not really honoring the real Roosevelt if you show him in a wheelchair. And so they compromised. You can see the wheelchair, but it's not the main focus of things. He didn't use a modern wheelchair, as we know it. He used these kitchen chairs with wheels on them that he designed. So and that's one of those fun, controversial things in history. What do you show? How do you, as times change, we look at things through a different lens. How do we show the past? I was watching a documentary, a movie this morning about Pope John Paul II, whose 100th birthday it is today. Hard to believe. But he had a quote, and he's talking about Poland as they were being overrun by the Nazis. And part of the ways for Poland to survive was to keep their culture alive and to do what they could via storing of documents and plays and things like that. And his quote was, "The only way to have a future is to save our past." I think that's very true when talking about history. And so having Roosevelt, the thing about the memorial, which is, I got this book at a used bookstore in Portland, which is really beautiful, but the building of the place and what it means, and it's divided up in different sections. There's a first term, a second term, a third term, and then an end. And each section talks about different parts of what was going on: the war, the Depression, the Dust Bowl. And I think I on my list of places to go, but haven't been there yet. But it's supposed to be a beautiful, beautiful place. And Priscilla clearly has been there. So does anyone know? One other thing. So Hyde Park Memorial. Okay. Yeah, the Roosevelt Institute in New York, which is connected sort of with the FDR Library, is like the think tank, and it promotes the Roosevelt's ideals and philosophies in the political action today. I get the sense it's more driven by Eleanor's ideology than Franklin's, based on what we've seen about the two of them. She was much more of an ideological person than he was. But if you're interested in looking at what they do, their web address is rooseveltinstitute.org. And there's tons of stuff to look at on there, and you can learn more about what they're doing and how they see certain issues, and judge for yourself how well they're doing in keeping with the Roosevelt tradition and focus. So those are just some housekeeping things. Let's talk a little bit about these kids. Wow. These kids. It's like, really? You want to tell people you're a Roosevelt? Because we're not so sure we want you around. I think as we've seen, the Roosevelts' inability or ability to deal with personal things sometimes kind of sets a tone for the family coming up. And I think as every kid does, they watch what their parents do, and hopefully you take the good and get rid of the bad. But sometimes those don't always happen, and your kids turn out to be more like you than you want them to. And certainly with the Roosevelts, there's some evidence that they learned some of the wrong lessons, I think, in some ways. There are 5 of them. There's actually 6, but the first Franklin Jr. dies at a very young age. There's a picture in the Roosevelt book by Ken Burns, the companion piece. There's a necklace that Eleanor used to wear that the kids would all teethe on, and all the necklaces all bent from the kids gnawing on her little ring she wore on her neck. Their first child was Anna Roosevelt. She was born in 1906, so shortly after they got married. And she grew up and got married to a guy named Curtis Dahl, who was a financial guy. They had 2 children, Anna and Curtis. Anna is still alive and spends much of her time in Maine. She's been very active in things in Maine. I tried to track her down. She's actually been profiled in Maine Magazine a couple years ago, but I was not able to track her down. That would have been a fun person to have talked about. Roberta? I'm going to unmute you. Hang on.
Just about Anna, FDR's great-granddaughter, would she be?
Granddaughter.
Okay. 3 years ago, at the Maine Retired Teachers Convention in Augusta that we do every year, she spoke.
Oh, did she?
Yeah, and she, at that time, lived in Emden and was the CEO of Goodwill Northern New England.
Right.
So,
She's no longer the CEO of that, and it's hard to track her down. So what maybe I'll do is I'll track her down over the summer, write her a note and tell her about the class and the interest you all had. If she's his granddaughter, she was in her 80s, I think. Well, you probably heard her. So her brother Curtis just died, and he's always the guy that shows up in all the Roosevelt TV shows. So I'll see if we can track her down and let you guys know, but I was not able to do that before class. So Anna gets divorced from her husband Curtis Dahl in 1934. She marries Clarence Bottager in 1935. They have another son named John. She works kind of in the press, freelancing, editing, that kind of stuff for years, which is what her second husband is also involved in doing. Clearly, her second husband really struggles with things because he commits suicide in 1950. They just gotten divorced, and he committed suicide. And she married again to a guy who's a doctor named James Halstead. And after the Roosevelt White House years, the kids, for the most part, just kind of, well, at least Anna did, found a way to kind of quietly go about her life and just live things as she could. But there's nothing much about her after 1952 when she gets married for the third time. And she died in 1975. But she was the one who, when her father was president, she, particularly the last years or so of his life, she traveled with him everywhere he went. She was at Yalta and Tehran, places like that. She was the family representative, I guess, in a way, but she was the one who in the family kind of provided for him and took care of him, helped him have that link to family. When you're traveling, doing presidential business, you like to have someone around for the family to help you feel grounded. And she was there for that, but she's also the one who facilitated the visits of Lucy Rutherford, to her father. She's also the one, if you read between the lines, was getting somewhat irritated with her mother because she couldn't understand why her mother, if her father was as unwell as he was and facing these huge decisions to make about the end of the war and everything, she felt her mother was badgering her father about all these little things she wanted to do, these programs and things like that he wasn't interested in. And that seemed to bother her somewhat. And so I think her idea was, if Lucy Mercer's there can be some relief, some relaxation, some female companionship that doesn't irritate him all the time. But you can imagine what it must have been like for Eleanor to go down to Warm Springs and find out not only had Lucy been there and had just left a while before she got there, but to find out that your own daughter has been facilitating these meetings between your husband and his former mistress. So it's a double whammy. I honest to God don't know how Eleanor survived the emotional trauma of those two events back to back. And apparently she and Anna were able to repair the relationship going forward, but it was pretty tense for a while. But I can imagine why. If your kids were trying to facilitate something like that. The second child is James Roosevelt. Like all of the kids, the boys anyway, they usually go to Groton and then to Harvard, which James does. He's born in 1907. He also went to St. Albans, which is a prep school in D.C., where a lot of the political and foreign leaders' kids go when they're living there. After graduation, he stayed in Massachusetts and became very involved in Democratic politics in Massachusetts. He became very good friends with Joseph P. Kennedy, and is credited as being one of the ones who really pushed Joe's appointment to be ambassador to the court of St. James. That he was the one whispering in his father's ear, in spite of Franklin's reservations about that. James was one going, "Hey, pick Joe, pick Joe, pick Joe." And after Louis Howe died in 1936, James kind of took over the duties of chief of staff in that sense. He and Missy kind of shared the responsibilities, I guess. They didn't really have a chief of staff. Now they do. Presidents didn't have them for the most part. Truman didn't have one. He kind of had Clark Clifford. Eisenhower had one. Sherman Adams, who's a New England figure. Kennedy didn't have one. Johnson had one, but how can you be Lyndon Johnson's chief of staff? Nixon had Haldeman. Ford had Cheney. Carter had Hamilton Jordan, and on and on and on. In 1936, also, James was appointed a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Marine Corps. Like that. Didn't join the bottom ranks. Didn't join as a first lieutenant or second lieutenant. Was appointed a lieutenant colonel, which doesn't really go over well with the guys in the lower ranks. But you kind of, what are you going to do? Raise your, I'm sorry. Mr. Roosevelt shouldn't be. Oh, his dad's. Oh, okay, sorry. You know, it's just the way things go sometimes. And that gives him more entree into the White House. Actually, Time magazine during this time labeled him as the assistant president. He was that close to his father and that busy with his dad. In 1941, he went on a world trip for his father, gathering information, meeting with foreign leaders to kind of get a sense of what the world was doing, how it was coming apart, what people could be doing. And then he decided when the war started, he joined the Marines and he resigned his commission lieutenant colonel and got in at a lower level and worked his way back up the ranks. He served after duty in the Pacific, and he stayed in the Marine Corps until 1959 in the reserves, and eventually retired as a brigadier general. But he seemed to know that going into the war as lieutenant colonel without any experience wasn't a good idea. He might want to just start at the beginning and work his way back up, which he did. In 1954, he ran for Congress. Oh my gosh, Roosevelt ran for office. From California. He served for 5 terms. There were some business controversies around him in the 1980s. But that's going to happen. People tend to have a microscope up to you if you're the son of a president or vice president, perhaps. He was married 4 times. His first wife, Betsy Cushing, he was married in 1940. They had 2 girls. He married Danielle Schneider in 1941 to 1956. They had 2 boys and a girl. He married again in 1956 to 1969. He had a woman named Gladys Owens. They had a son named Hall. And in 1969 to 1991, he was married to a woman named Mary Winskill, and they had a daughter. So he died in 1991, and he was the last surviving Roosevelt child to die. I remember the news when he died, because that was the big tagline. James Roosevelt died, last surviving child of FDR. If you're the last surviving of anybody like that, you're going to get yourself in the news because you're it, the last connection. Elliot Roosevelt.
Mike.
Yes, Chuck.
Oh, I just wanted to make some comments about James Roosevelt.
Mm-hmm.
I was under the misimpression that I had worked on his congressional campaign.
Mm-hmm.
But that was not true because I was in Korea at that time.
Okay.
And in graduate school.
Okay.
However, he was the head of the California Democratic Party apparatus.
Mm-hmm.
From what 1946 to 1952.
Okay.
So I would have been campaigning for people that he had promoted in his official duties then. And so that's why the name was familiar to him.
That's great.
The other thing that came out in some of my looking up his record, that when he was in his 3rd marriage, that was quite a bitter divorce thing, and the account is that he was stabbed 7 times by his
Wow.
divorcing wife.
Eesh.
So he had kind of a troubled marital thing, and then
Yeah.
he was involved in what they call the Vesco.
Yep. It's a business.
The Vesco. Well, he wasn't involved. He was associated with Vesco in this iOS organization,
Yep.
and that kind of soiled his career. Also, the thing that was most troubling to me is that he was the head of Democrats for Nixon, and then head of Democrats for Reagan in successive elections.
An early Reagan Democrat, as they'd say.
Right.
Wow. He also wrote a book called My Parents, A Differing View by James Roosevelt. And this was written to counteract the work that his brother had done, Elliott Roosevelt. Elliott wrote 2 books about his parents, The Roosevelts of Hyde Park and The Roosevelts, A Rendezvous with Destiny, about the White House years. And these stand out because this one talks a lot about Missy LeHand and their relationship, and he believes that Missy LeHand and Franklin had an actual affair and wasn't afraid to say it. These are kind of salacious, behind-the-scenes stories about their parents. And the other kids didn't like his books about their parents, and so James actually wrote a book counteracting what Elliott had said. Elliott was born in 1910. He went to Groton. He refused to go to college. Went off to work in the aviation industry and joined the Air Force. And rose through the ranks, ended up being a brigadier general in the U.S. Army Air Force. And one of the things you hear about when you read about him, he was a reconnaissance officer. And he flew a number of missions as a reconnaissance officer in the Air Force. He is supposedly to have been in the backup plane in 1944. Joe Kennedy Jr., who was supposed to be president of the United States, according to the family lore. Jack had been injured in the Pacific the year before, and there's always this fighting back and forth between the 2 of them. And Joe had been slated to go home, but volunteered for what was basically a suicide mission. They were going to take a plane, load it with explosives, and fly it into V2 rocket sites on the coast. And something happened on the way over, just over the coast of England. The plane that Joe Kennedy and his fellow pilot were in blew up. Literally nothing left. He got that much TNT in a plane, nothing left. And supposedly Elliott Roosevelt was in the plane behind them and saw this happen and talked about it. The problem is, when people looked at the actual records of that flight when they were declassified, Elliott Roosevelt is nowhere near that incident. He did not see it happen, but it became kind of a thing he kind of passed along. The ironic thing about that whole story is that the V2 rocket sites that were sending this plane in to blow up had been moved the month before. So Joe Kennedy literally died for no reason. I mean, he was trying to outperform his brother, and it ended in a tragedy. That for years had Roosevelt connections, and that couldn't have helped Joe Kennedy's attitude towards the president, because now he's got one son almost killed and one son killed, and he blames it all on Franklin. He is considered Eleanor's favorite son. She makes no bones about that, apparently. I've not found actual evidence of that, but that's what you read here and there. And in that end, he actually wrote a series of mystery novels starring Eleanor Roosevelt as the sleuth, which I remember reading a couple of those. They're quite interesting. Catherine Smith has written a number of mystery novels where Missy LeHand is the sleuth. I read a book once about World War II where JFK Jr. was the sleuth. So it's kind of a genre where you can do take historical personages and make them. I don't know what Eleanor. I don't remember the books well. You probably still get them. What she's sleuthing about, but he made a separate career doing that stuff. In addition to the books he wrote about his parents, this whole series of Eleanor Roosevelt mystery novels are out there. He too was married 5 times. He was married to Elizabeth Donner from 1932 to 1933. Wow, that's a long marriage. They had 1 child. He was married to Ruth Goggins from 33 to 44, and they had 3 kids. Then he married Faye Emerson in 1950 to 1944 to 1950. Now here's the connection I have. He married a woman named Minowa Bell. No connection to my family at all. from 1951 to 1960. But the Dude Ranch in Sheridan, Wyoming, that my family used to go to, which is where I met Amy. Before I met Amy, one year, Minowa Bell was there as a guest, and she was a hoot. She was a character. You define the word character. It's Minowa Bell. It comes from Money in California, and she just told story. And here I was sitting talking to a woman who was married to Elliott Roosevelt. Frankly, I was like 3 degrees separated from FDR. I thought that was pretty cool. Now I always remember she died a few years after we first met her, but she was only married to him for 6 or 7 years. But she was a hoot. And just to hear stories about, she never met Franklin, but she met Eleanor and thought she was a wonderful lady. I think she liked her because she liked Elliott. That, Eleanor liked Elliott the most, or made that clear. So he later ran for mayor of Palm Beach. And then he divorced Minowa and married Patricia Whitehead in 1960. He adopted her 4 kids. They had a baby named Livingston, who I'm going to assume was named after Livingston Davis, who was Franklin's friend who died of suicide back in the 20s. After a while, he left the country, probably to avoid paying taxes. He lived abroad, but eventually settled back in Arizona and died there in 1990. So he was a controversial one. He wrote that book that didn't paint his parents in every positive light. FDR Jr. was born in 1914. He went to Groton and Harvard. Then he went to UVA for his law degree. He was thought by most people to be the most like his father. He certainly looked the most like his father, but he acted the most like his father. He had the charisma of most of his father. He joined the U.S. Navy Reserve, was decorated for actions at Casablanca and Sicily in the Pacific. He was a lawyer. He also was in the U.S. House from New York from 1949 to 1955. Now, in 1960, he helped JFK in West Virginia win the primary that JFK needed to win. And they cast nasty aspersions against Hubert Humphrey, which weren't very nice. And FDR would say, my daddy and Jack's daddy were just like this. And that, for people in West Virginia who haven't paid attention, they're going, oh, wow, great. Because they've all got pictures of FDR in their homes. And so if this kid comes in and says, vote for Jack, he and my daddy are like, well, she's lying. The ambassador and Joe couldn't stand each other at the end of their lives. But what does it matter? If FDR Jr. says they're like that, they're like that. He later went on to become the Undersecretary of Commerce. He also was a owner of a large Fiat dealership in America. He owned all the franchises for Fiat in this country back in the day. He made a lot of money as an auto dealer. He died in 1988 of lung cancer, and he too was married 5 times. His first wife was Ethel DuPont from 37 to 49. They had 2 kids, Christopher and FDR III. His second wife was Suzanne Perrin from 49 to 70. Their 2 children were Nancy and Laura. And then in 1970, he married Felisa Schaff Wasberg Sarnoff. That's a mouthful. The key word to remember there is Sarnoff. She's related to the Sarnoff family, who's so big in broadcasting. They divorced in 76. And in 1977, he married Patricia Oakes. And they had a son named John. They divorced in 1980. And he married a final time in 84 to a woman named Linda Weicker, who's related to the Weicker family of Connecticut. I think Lowell Weicker was her brother. I'm not sure. I'll double check that. But these guys clearly, there's something they haven't learned. Something's example their parents said or other people, but they're marrying, and not often for long periods of time either. 2 or 3 years, some of them, a year. So they're not happy. Something's not clicking with them, I don't think. John Roosevelt, who's the youngest, was born in 1916. He went to Groton and Harvard. He was the least close to his parents because I think when he's born, within 2 years after he's born, the Lucy Rutherford affair is discovered. There's a drifting apart, and Franklin's gone then again after polio. When he's 5 or 6, when you need your dad around, he's on the houseboat, the Rocco in Florida. So he's the least close to his parents because they're both going on their separate ways in that way. He worked for the TVA one summer during the first years in the White House, the Tennessee Valley Authority. He first was going to register for the war as a conscientious objector. Now, how do you think that looks? if the President of the United States has us involved in a war and his own kid wants to be not that there's anything wrong with being a conscientious objector, I think it's fantastic. But can you imagine the pressure that must have been brought to bear on this young man to be a conscientious, and your dad's the president? Imagine what it'd be like today. But he ended up being in the U.S. Navy and served in the war, ended the war as a lieutenant commander. He got involved in PR work. That was his life's dream and work that he did the rest of his life. Now, unlike his brothers, he's relatively stable in the marriage department. He's only married twice to Anne Clark. They have Helen, Anne, Sarah, and Jean are their 4 kids. Sarah is the daughter who died at Hyde Park in 1960, the day before Jack Kennedy went to visit Eleanor at Valkill. Remember we told you that story? That's John's daughter. He is then married from 1965 to his death to Irene McAlpin, and he died in 1981. But he seems to be the most stable. Maybe it's because he was the last one to come out, that he didn't have all these other experiences with the family as much. He was a little more distant. He didn't look at them for examples, but he was relatively stable, only married twice. So those are the kids. Any questions about the kids? They're quite fun. Most of their kids are still alive. There's a few, but most of the Roosevelt grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and the Roosevelts are involved in stuff. They're involved in different philanthropic organizations. They're involved in different educational, political stuff. If you Google Roosevelt's grandkids, they'll pop up. And there's such a wide, you've got Curtis, who was born in 1936. And then because there was such disparity between the Roosevelt kids, you've got Roosevelt grandchildren who were born in the 1960s and early 70s. So there's like a 2-generation span of Roosevelt grandkids based on how many times the kids were married. Yes, Marilyn. I mean, hang on. Yeah, go ahead.
Are any of his grandchildren conservative?
I don't know. I didn't look at the political philosophy. We talked about it before. Chuck mentioned that one of them was citizens or Democrat Roosevelt's for Nixon and Reagan stuff. I don't know. There's got to be somebody in there who's rejected the whole family story to go the other way. Every family has somebody like that just kind of, you people are nuts. But I'll look into that and see what I can find out about that. That's a good question. I don't know of their political persuasion on most of them. But they're all still around. They're all still involved in different stuff. And that's got to be a name, when you go into a room. What's your name? Roosevelt. Wow. Are you related? Yes, I am. And to have both legacies be on both sides of the family, it's pretty amazing. So one article I read, I'll throw out some sentences and see what you think. I want you all to respond to this. This is an article talking about Roosevelt's legacy. William Leuchtenberg was regarded as one of the premier Roosevelt scholars for a long time until he passed away a few years ago. Let me read you some sentences and then I'll toss these out for debate amongst you all. Roosevelt may have done more during those 12 years to change American society and politics than any of his predecessors in the White House, except Abraham Lincoln. What do you think about that? Would you agree? Peter? You guys can unmute yourself if you want to ask a question. That's fine. You're just going to nod?
I agree.
Okay. What do you think he did that makes that true?
It's the number of things he did. And it was also in his situation, it was the times, because there were so many things to be done.
I like that.
That's my thought.
No, I think you're spot on. It's the timing and the number of things that had to be done, that he took on those things at the right time. If you tried those any other time, they probably wouldn't have happened. So are there any other people in history you thought could have been plopped into that era that could have done the same things, or is Roosevelt special of those times? Does the person make the times, or the times make the person? Anyone? Come on. You guys.
I wonder if in Truman's situation, the times made the person.
There might be some truth to that.
Oh, and another thing I wanted to say, when you were talking about detective novels, maybe it was his style, because I know that Margaret Truman, isn't she the one who wrote several detective novels?
Yep. And I don't know, did she have her parents as, I mean, the thing about the Roosevelt novels was that Eleanor was the protagonist. I don't know if Margaret Truman's, I don't think Harry or Bess were.
I've read one of them, I know, but I don't think he was, no. I think it was a separate.
Anybody else? Any thoughts? Yes, Marilyn.
Well, I do think Roosevelt was exceptional. The country was really suffering from a lot of things, both during Lincoln's administration and Roosevelt's. Probably the country had never been in such turmoil as, either time. And I think Roosevelt, he rose to the situation, but I also think that without Eleanor, he might not have done the things that he did.
Totally, 100%. 100%.
Well, she was behind many things, and Frances Perkins as well.
Yeah. Roberta?
Just wanted to make the comment that from everything I've been reading, it seems that he was very open to ideas from other people. They weren't all his own, but of course he gets credited for most of them.
Well, being president, you get credit for the good ideas,
right?
And saddled with the bad ideas too. Right. Elaine, you had your hand up.
I almost think that they were the original dynamic duo. I don't know that if one could do everything they did without the other one. Even though they weren't really close in their married life, I think they were very close. I don't know, simpatico or something. They had the same ideas and they could bounce them off each other. I think I wonder if, like you said, if Roosevelt could have done what he did without Eleanor.
I don't think he could have. But I think there's a lot of historians now who think that they were closer than we think they were. Chuck?
I think one of the things that favored Roosevelt was he had a great sense of eloquence. So he could, watching the films in the Ken Burns Intimate History, you could see how he was a master of words, a master of delivery. And he also, at the same time, had this touch for the common people. He could recognize what their problems were. Perhaps that was Eleanor's influence. But I think these two things were what made him a great leader, is that he could speak to the issues in a charming way, in an eloquent, spirit-lifting way, and he could also but he could speak to African Americans and people suffering from poverty and things like that. So I think that was a great gift, a personal trait that he had.
I think one of the things that he has that a lot of folks in his social class have, that some folks don't have, is he doesn't pretend to be something he's not. He's just Franklin Roosevelt. And you can be scraping together 2 pieces of food to survive and meet him, and you think he's on your side. He's not going to come dressed in shorts and a t-shirt to dress like he's like you. Some politicians mistake that. They think they have to dress up for the appearance or dress down. Roosevelt and others who are really empathetic are just who they are, and people appreciate them for who they are because they're not trying to act like they're different. So they're actually listening to what they're talking about. So I think, he clearly has that ability. Marilyn?
I think he had an awesome ability to bring Americans together. Not to say he didn't have any opponents, because they were there.
Oh, yeah.
But the great majority of Americans really came together during the Great Depression and certainly during the war.
Yeah. Anybody else? Robert Dallek wrote a good book a couple years ago called Roosevelt: A Political Life, and he gets right at it. He talks, Roosevelt was this great defining figure of America in the 20th century, and there are downsides to it. The internment of Japanese Americans is something we look at now and go, oh my God, but we weren't in the room. The United States response to people in Europe, the Jews fleeing from Europe, trying to get away from the Nazi repression, is somewhat limited. It's better than some, and not as good as others. How do you balance that stuff out? And these are things that you can't excuse these things, but these things in and of themselves, I don't believe make him a bad person. I think they're just things he's struggling with. I wish he would have done more in both those cases, but he had blinders on certain things. He's getting pressure from people. He's got political things to figure out. So all those things come into the mix. His response, we look at the internment of the Japanese Americans in particular, is horrible. There's no other word for it. It's horrible. But you stack that in amongst everything else. But he's still a great man, still a great leader. You have to balance some things out. But that's what happens in history, because oftentimes these figures, it's easier when they're gone to kind of throw things at them and stack them up and say all the bad stuff and not look at the good stuff, because the bad stuff's more fun to write about and look at. And history is like that. The other thing we're seeing, I think, with Roosevelt, his whole definition of the presidency, which is different than, and that's what we're seeing now, right? I mean, this argument goes on and on and on and on. How much power does the president have? Some presidents think they have unlimited power. Some presidents don't think they have any power. Some act like they have all the power in the world, and some act like they have no power in the world. I think when the day comes we start writing books, there was a book a couple years ago called James Buchanan, The Worst President in History. And why is he so bad? Because he did nothing to stop the Civil War, and he saw it coming. He didn't do anything. Let the next guy take care of it. We'll see how it compares to the last couple of years now. Historians will sink their teeth into this stuff. But they've been sinking their teeth into Roosevelt for years. What is his philosophy on government? Is it too big? Politicians who came after him, LBJ was an unabashed Roosevelt supporter. He tied himself to Roosevelt as a young congressman. JFK tried to push himself a little bit away from him. Other people have come down the pike who have embraced Roosevelt, and other ones who don't want Roosevelt. But at the end of the day, he changed not just the way the country worked and how the world operated. He changed how the presidency works and what instruments that can be used to change things. But you'll hear people discuss, listen in the background, hear politics, and they'll sometimes harken back to the New Deal and how horrible it was, or it wasn't enough. And so that's one thing about Roosevelt. We don't have these discussions about Warren G. Harding or Benjamin Harrison. We have them about Franklin Roosevelt because he changed fundamentally about how we work and how we operate, and we're still dealing with today. Elaine, you had your hand up?
Yeah. Do you think, Mike, that it was a mistake for him to run for the fourth term? I mean, knowing how, hindsight's 50-50, but how ill he really was, that he was as effective as somebody else might have been?
Well, I think we've discussed a little bit, and you guys can read more about it. His performance at Yalta certainly suffered because he wasn't well. Would he have given up that much stuff to the Soviets if he'd been in full sense of his faculties? I don't know. It's one of those coulda, shoulda, woulda things. Personally, I think he was far, far too sick to run for that fourth term. But are we really going to think that we're going to let someone else be in there? We almost had to have him, And I think people knew. I think instinctively, well, he's not well. People that saw him like, oof, oh, wow. But what are you going to do? And I think timing has a lot to do with that. I think there's a reason he died just before the war ended. Lincoln died just as the war ended. And so these men are seen as sacrifices. They're the last sacrifices in some cases. They did everything they had to, and it took them too. They died in the line of duty in that sense. But yeah, physically, I think he shouldn't have run for the fourth term, but I think emotionally and strategically, he couldn't have. And you were going to talk him out of it anyway, right? He's like, I think he honestly thought he was going to go on, and he was working on a speech to give to the UN the day he died. So yeah, that's a good question. But I personally, I think he probably should have done it. But historically, I think he needed to do it in that sense. I mean, he had to. Would Roosevelt be as discussed today if he hadn't died in the middle of his duties, right? I mean, if he just retired. I don't know. The one things that we talk about, and these are the things I love because these are the things I think his gift to all of us are the 4 freedoms that he defined. The freedom of speech, the freedom of worship, the freedom from want, and the freedom from fear. And Rockwell did a series of paintings of those. They're absolutely fantastic. And they're focused on New England town hall meetings and stuff like that. The one guy, the freedom of speech, is a guy in a town hall meeting, a town meeting, which I love doing. I mean, I think they're absolutely fantastic to do all those things because 15, 20 people control the town. Everybody else, I don't know how to go that. Well, then, don't complain when you want to worry about the fire budget or this budget. Just go to the bloody meeting once a year. That's how we run things around here. But those things, I think, are his final gift. I think her gift is the Declaration of Human Rights, which is a great template and something we should aspire to. Not always easy to do. But I think his greatest gift was to define the 4 freedoms: the freedom of speech, the freedom of worship, the freedom from want, and the freedom from fear. That's a legacy to leave behind that we're still grappling with. What does that mean? How do we define that for each generation? And I think somewhere he's got to be sitting there kind of going, yeah, okay. They're doing pretty good. They got to work on some stuff, but he had to work on some stuff. But the fact that we're still talking about him, still looking to him for guidance and leadership, I think says a lot about who he was and what he meant to us. He's been dead for 75 years. And it's like in some ways he never left because we're still discussing these things in a public forum. I think that's fantastic. Anything else? Anybody? Marcel?
Just a question. That, it took a long time for him to decide to go into World War II, but do you think if Pearl Harbor had never happened, that would have?
At some point, we were going to have to get involved. When it would be, I don't know.
Yeah.
If England had fallen, we might have stepped in. I mean, and they were awfully close in some ways.
Right.
But Americans have never wanted. We don't like to go into wars unless we're provoked, unless we have a reason for it.
Right.
So, and that was always. I mean, that was the discussion at the missile crisis table in 1962. They were talking about attacking Cuba without any warning, and Bobby Kennedy put a note and he passed it down to Jack, and he said, "Now I know how Tojo felt planning Pearl Harbor. That's not how we're supposed to do things. We don't sneak in and do that kind of stuff." But yeah, and I'm sure there's some books out there that would look into what would have happened if Pearl Harbor hadn't happened. But again, they knew that was coming too. They knew there was something was going to happen, not necessarily specifically. And every president makes mistakes and doesn't get all the intelligence and stuff and doesn't act when they should. And sometimes it's okay, and sometimes it comes back to bite you for the rest of your life. So I wouldn't want the job. I used to want the job when I was a kid. I want to be president. Oh my God, see what it does to people? It's horrible.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
You said that the Americans don't like to be provoked into wars.
No. We don't like to go into wars without being provoked. So,
what about Teddy Roosevelt and the Spanish-American War?
Well, we were provoked, weren't we? They blew up our battleship, Peter. Come on. Or so they said.
So they said.
But he didn't have access.
I think he.
Well, he pushed that button, and he did it almost alone because he wanted to go do something. But the way the press portrayed it, it was the Spaniards and the Cubans conspired, and they blew up the ship. So we had to go. But now we find that was probably more of a mechanical failure than anything else. But that was the pretext. Gulf of Tonkin was the same. They attacked our ship in the Gulf of Tonkin. We have a pretext now. And so you have to look carefully about how those war powers are enacted, how they're used, what's the impetus for going to war? Is it justified? It's an interesting question, and there's tons of books and scholarly articles we can get into debate those. That's what the talk shows are for, and all those talking heads who have some opinion on this stuff because they've done the research and looked into it.
William Randolph Hearst said, "Give me the incident and I'll give you the war."
But the average person didn't know that. They didn't know Randolph Hearst was out there begging for something to do.
He needed to sell newspapers.
Yeah, exactly. If people bought them. People need to watch TV and they need to sell ad time and all that other stuff. It's a vicious cycle that kind of goes around and round and round and round. So unless you guys have any other questions, as Shelley said, there's some stuff coming up this summer, some lectures going on. I'm looking to do a couple, you'll know more about that if you stay on the new and revamped and wonderful UMA Senior College website. And the Gersteins, right, Shelley and Gail right there, are the ones who do that. They're both modest about the work they do, but we wouldn't be here if they weren't here helping us out. And I remember the day Shelley came to his first meeting and we're like, ooh, this guy knows a lot about technology, but you have to be careful about not overloading him. And look what he's doing now. I mean, I think we did it the right way. And he and Gail do wonderful work for us. So all this stuff that happens online and the technology we're using now to get through this is those two right there. So they deserve a round of applause. Thank you, Shelley and Gail. I'm just Shelley, I sent in a thing yesterday for fall classes. I want to teach a class on Lincoln. Another fascinating. And as my wife says, good, you can do a class about a Republican. So we'll see how that goes. But he's one I was trying to think of, Amos, you could do this. I've already touched upon that. I haven't done anything about Lincoln, and I love Lincoln. And that'll be the fall class. If the curriculum committee approves it, I'll cross my fingers. One other thing, I want to thank all of you for the very generous envelope I got last week. Priscilla, I know you're behind that because your address was the return address. You should hide it better. Thank you, all of you who part of that. They're going to love me at Barnes & Noble when they reopen. I'll be the first one in line. Let's go. So, although I think Jonathan wants to use part of that gift card for his own goods, I'm like, dude, go mow the lawn and make some money. But I think this has been a lot of fun. I think this Zoom thing has worked rather well in spite of some of the minor glitches. I think I've enjoyed it. Although I got to tell you, I'm getting tired of Zoom this and Zoom that and Zoom everything now. Everything's Zoom. I want to have stock in Zoom because they're making money hand over fist. But I think this has worked, and I think it's helped you all stay connected. I don't know how many of you have ventured out too far from your homes or anything like that. More and more we can do that. Just be safe when you go out there. There are people who aren't thinking about what they're doing. I was at the Hobby Lobby in Waterville the other day. They've opened up and they did some paints for a model I'm working on. And 95% of people are masked up and standing 6 feet away. And so you go in, you get your thing, you wash your hands, you're probably okay. But I love the people that walk through without a mask and the people in the mask start yelling at them. Oh yeah, thanks for not wearing a mask. So the judging of people is getting a little bit crazy. If you go into stores and see a sign that says you must wear a mask in here and there's people inside without a mask, I asked a friend of mine who works in one of those stores, and they have no way enforcing that rule. And they're all a little bit of afraid because you saw what happened a couple weeks ago in Virginia, I think it was, where a guy at a Dollar General said you can't come in without a mask. Lady went home, got her husband, they came back and shot him dead. So they're afraid. And they, in this tense time, I'd be afraid too. But I think by and large, most people, in spite of what you read, are following the dictates, doing what they're asked, staying safe. The fact that all of us are still here together after 9 weeks, all of us are safe and are doing well. That's a good sign because we're all doing the right things. It's going to take some time. They're talking baseball maybe later on this summer. No fans, but baseball games being played. Premier League in Europe has just announced they're going to start training for games starting in a month or so. No fans, which really is going to be, I mean, baseball without fans is one thing, but European soccer without fans is an entirely different thing altogether. I don't know. I don't know. There'll be a lot more drinking than you've ever heard of before. People can't go to a game in Manchester, Liverpool, or someplace like that. It's going to be nuts.
Mike.
Yes, Peter, and then Marilyn.
You were talking about making models.
Mm-hmm.
So I have to admit that I was kind of rude because while you're giving your lecture, I'm working on paper models.
Oh, cool.
And so here is one of, I don't know if you can see it very well.
Globe.
It's the Globe Theater. And if I take this part away, you can.
Oh, cool.
I don't know if you can see it or not.
Where'd you get that?
My brother had it and sent it to me. He was never going to make it, so I don't know where he got it from.
I just
But
found
it's
out.
from the original. It's from Stratford on Avon. You know, somebody
Yeah.
made it.
I just found out in the last couple of months that when I was doing some family history stuff, that my 10 times great grandfather was born in Southwark, England, which is the suburb of London where the Globe sits. So maybe he went to a play there. I don't know. I doubt it, but you
Great.
never know. Marilyn, you had your hand up?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wondered if someday you could do something on the Red Sox, you know, the comeback kids,
Oh,
because I think of all the years that they waited to finally win the World Series.
yeah.
Do you remember that?
Oh, yeah. I want to show you guys a clip, if I can show it on my phone. A couple years ago in fourth grade, Jonathan he did a project as FDR, and he dressed up as FDR for the last day. He had a bow tie and he bought pince nez glasses and he held a piece of chalk like a cigarette. But when he wheeled himself into class, he borrowed the wheelchair from the student nurse, and then wheeled himself into. They wheeled him into class, and I said, "How did?" He said, "How did FDR act?" I said, "He waved big waves. It's all part of the attention. Look up here, don't look down here." He's just kind of that personality that came in the room. So if you see if you can watch this, you see him in the wheelchair. He had a good time doing. He loved being FDR. He got, we sent that video to the FDR library and some other stuff he did, and they got a kick out of it. So the good thing is, like everything else, if we teach these things and pass these stories down to the next level, as Garo Watiwa said, if we don't preserve, if we don't, what do you say? Something about the past and the future. I can't remember those notes for it. I don't remember what they were. The only way to have a future is to save our past. And that's what I love doing. And that's what I think the Roosevelts are. When we come out of this and we move forward as a country, we have examples of people like the Roosevelts to fix ourselves to and move our country forward and learn some lessons, which is what he would have done. What worked, what didn't work.
There's also the saying that if you forget history or ignore history, you'll
condemned to repeat it.
Live to repeat it.
Yeah. There's some truth in that. In there. Gene.
Mike, on the brief discussion of memorials to FDR in Washington.
Yep.
There's also a monument to him, which is a component of the World War II memorial.
Okay, in New Orleans.
Extremely controversial. I don't know if you want to discuss that any further.
I don't know much about that.
Another thing, the photo that you showed of the wheelchair that was essentially a kitchen chair with small casters on it.
Yep.
I believe that is still in Hyde Park.
There are a number of them around places where he was. They have some up, I know up at Campobello. He didn't try, he just left, those were left in places we needed them. But yeah, there's one of the original ones in Hyde Park. The greatest fear he had, we talked about this at the beginning, was fire and getting out of fire. And he practiced for hours and hours and hours, pulling himself up the stairs at Hyde Park and then trying to get out of the house. And I can't imagine what that would be like to be worried about that. Ellen, you had your hand up? Or are you just stretching your arm? You just waving? So, any other questions or comments? I can't believe I'm gonna let Gene have the last word from you guys. I don't know much about the controversy at the memorial, Gene. I haven't looked into that. I just know the two things are the block outside the archives and then the Roosevelt Memorial on the island. Yep.
That was about the World War II memorial. It's just beautiful.
Yeah.
But the controversy was that it showed FDR in a wheelchair, and many people did not want to show the wheelchair.
Yeah.
I think they do show it now. When I first went through I can't remember if it was draped over or what, but you couldn't see what was behind there.
Huh.
That went on for several years, I think, before it got resolved and they finally showed it.
Yep. All right.
Mike,
Yep.
the email that I sent you about the two songs, did you
Mhm.
get a chance to listen to those?
I did briefly. Yes, those were
Okay.
great.
Wow.
And that's you know whenever I hear
They're really strong, very
whenever I hear Going Home, I think of Roosevelt. That's
unbelievable song.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the other one too, I did not know of
Yeah.
until I saw that. Yeah. Okay.
It's like anytime I hear Paul Anka Priscilla now, I go, here's the guy who wrote My Way.
Yeah, he did.
Thank God it's not his version we remember.
That's right. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
I
Marilyn. You're muted.
just wonder, how many books have been written about the Roosevelts?
Oh my God. I've got
I don't think you mentioned any of those.
Well,
There
I've
was
got a
one-
bunch of them behind me. That whole middle shelf is all Roosevelt books. My wife claims I teach classes about things I want to buy books about. Might be some truth to
Well,
that.
buy something by the about the Red Sox.
Marilyn, I have a whole bookcase of Red Sox books. Don't worry about it. How much do you check? How many books? I know Lincoln has thousands. Napoleon has thousands. Kennedy has thousands. Let me see. Usually there's a rough number. I can find it out here. I'm guessing it's quite a few, and especially if you combine both sides of the family.
Which one do you think is best?
You know, there's all sorts of different stuff. If you want the best, my favorite book on Roosevelt is A First Class Temperament by Jeffrey Ward. One most people know and enjoy is No Ordinary Time by Doris Kearns Goodwin. All those were on that list I sent you back at the beginning of class. Conrad Black's Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Champion of Freedom is one of the most award-winning and probably the most comprehensive single volume. But I've got books on Yalta. I've got books on He and Lucy. I got books on Eleanor. I've got books on what he was like as a kid. There's a whole book on FDR the sailor and what kind of impact being somebody who knew how to sail had an impact on his life as a Navy assistant secretary. We've got that book about he and his neighbors. There's all sorts of niches we can get into with Roosevelt. That didn't come off the one. Let me see if I can find how many books have been written about. How many? It helps to spell right. Books have been but the Roosevelts. It doesn't just gives me a list of different books. It doesn't give me you can get a list of books the best books, and those are all subjective, right? So there's thousands. There's got to be thousands of them, but I've got 50 right here. There's a whole shelf that the Brattle Bookshop in Boston. There's a whole bookcase just of Roosevelt books. Henry.
Yes. First, the trivia thing.
Yeah.
John was married to a relative of David Sarnoff, but Eliot was married to Faye Emerson, who was a radio TV star.
Yeah.
And then on your question about did the war make the man or did the man handle, I think both Lincoln and FDR were very stable people. And they took information from a lot of different people and they used it. They just didn't go off half-cocked and run. And I think that both of them have left us a very good, stable set of values. I mean, FDR has established so much good stuff that came and is still working for the American people. And, it gives me a great deal of fear when I see what's going on now.
The thing I love about both those guys is they're not ideological presidents.
No.
They're matter of fact, down to earth presidents.
Right. They were people. They were able to walk into the world and talk to anybody. FDR didn't care whether you were black and dirty and small
or whether you were the head of U.S. Steel.
Yeah.
He could talk to either one. And again, I agree with some of the information that Eleanor had a great deal to do with that.
Yeah.
And Abraham Lincoln was the same way. He came from the backwoods and he could talk to backwoods people, but he was comfortable talking to people that were very influential. And neither one of them was controlled by any particular facet of,
Right.
of
By themselves.
yeah, they stood up for the people, and they were people.
And I always liked the idea too of how funny they both genuinely were.
Yes, the humor, the sense of humor.
And that helped keep him. I mean, Lincoln was ridiculed for being funny when he shouldn't be funny. But he said, if I'm not funny, if I don't tell these stories, I'm going to go nuts.
And plus, it relates easier to people
Right.
when you have a sense of humor.
I mean, you all know the story when he met our own Harriet Beecher Stowe. He said to her, "Oh, you're the little lady who started this whole war," because she wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. And and then Franklin could also, the King of England, gets off the train in Hyde Park and he says, "Hiya, George." I mean, wow.
Yeah.
Imagine. Well, I guess we have seen what happens when you kind of do that nowadays, but they're just down to earth people.
Yeah, like Lincoln, when he met the little girl, told him he was ugly.
Yeah.
But they had grow a beard.
Well,
And
you
he
said if you
didn't
think
take offense to it. He just,
someone told Lincoln he was ugly, or called him two-faced.
yeah.
Do you think if I had the other option to have another face, I would have picked this one? So anyway, all right, I will let you all go. Thank you for the last 9 weeks. It's been fun. I am earnestly praying and lighting candles and everything else we can do that we'll be back in classes again in the fall. But if not, we will be right back here in September. I will get my stovepipe hat out, and we'll do 8 or 9 weeks on Abraham Lincoln. And that should be a fun one too. So, but look for stuff on the website shortly about what's coming up this summer, because we're going to keep connected that way too. So you all can't get rid of me that easily. Sorry. Thank you for the good questions. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening and sharing your experiences about these people. I think they're absolutely two of the most touchstone people we have had in our history. And make sure you tell your kids and grandkids about them, so that the story's not forgotten, and we can aspire to be, like I said in my note, I don't think we're attracted to our heroes because they're up here. We're attracted to our heroes because they're us, and we can see ourselves in what they do, which gives us hope to do things that we normally don't think we could do. So there you go. All right. Peace.
Mike,
Thank you so much, Mike.
Yep. See ya.
have a good summer.
Merci. And feel free, if you see me out and about, we can all say behind our masks. No thanks. Peace, everybody.
Peace.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.